speaker is Dr. Carmen Boulter. Carmen's been coming to the CPAK conferences for a couple of years and helping us on the film side and telling me about her work, and it's really fascinating. And I think she's been to Egypt 22 times, yes. I was telling her that's more days than I've been to college. She teaches at the graduate division at the University of Calgary, and she's written a book called Angels and Archetypes, an Evolutionary Map of Feminine Consciousness. Will you please welcome Dr. Carmen Boulter.
Thank you, Walter. I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to do today is show you some things that are hidden in plain sight about symbols of the sacred feminine in ancient Egypt. And looking at this diagram right here, we can see that she actually has two left hands, not a left hand and a right hand, and that's a deep symbolism that I'll describe a little bit later. But the other thing is the winged woman. The thing about a bird is a bird can walk along the ground and fly in the sky, so it's a symbol of high levels of consciousness. And then what we see is she's got a feather on the top of her headdress, and this is Mot, and it's the feather of truth. And when a person died, their heart would be weighed against the feather of truth. And this is a ceremony of the weighing of the hearts, and if someone had a heavy heart because they had done something immoral or killed or that sort of thing, then they wouldn't be allowed to go to the other side. And so this was part of the way that the ancient Egyptians taught the populace. So what I want to do is allow the images to speak for themselves. And what you can see here, this is from the 18th dynasty. This is Queen T and Amenhotep III, the parents of Akhenaten. And the woman has her arm around the man. And you can see the hand. And so women had a completely different status in ancient Egypt than we tend to acknowledge, because we are looking at ancient Egypt through the lenses of our own sociocultural context, which is patriarchal. Now, there's plenty of evidence that ancient Egypt was matrilineal, meaning that everything went through the mother line. The next pharaoh in dynastic times, which were patriarchal times in Egypt, had to marry the daughter of the present pharaoh, which indicates that they knew mitochondrial DNA. And I'll say more of that as we go along. But looking at matriarchal cultures, which is the subject of my book, means that we have to look much, much farther back. And 3113 BC corresponds to the beginning of the Mayan calendar, which is also the patriarchal era. The Bible tends to want us to think that we're 6,000 years old, and yet the mysteries go way, 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 way back. Now, most sacred sites are built on top of other sites. Most churches are on top of pagan sites. And so there's layers and layers and layers. But what we find is that the oldest layers are the megalithic ones, and the newest layers are the less sophisticated construction. So if we can tune ourselves to look with different eyes, then we can start to see other images. Now, again, you see the woman with her arm around the man, and the left foot is slightly forward. Now, a lot of people think that matriarchy is the opposite of patriarchy, and that's not the case. So many people are afraid that if we have a matriarchal culture, then the women are going to dominate the men and do that sort of thing. And that's not the answer, because basically the matriarchal concepts are about balance. It's not about domination in any way. And so it's, as you can see, the left foot is only slightly more forward, which means that we're leading slightly with the symbolic and the things that we can't see. Now, one of the mandates of patriarchy is that if you can't see it, it's not there. And yet there's all these worlds of the invisible that give us the strength of consciousness that we're really not supposed to talk about in this time frame. So again, big step, small step. So the image on the far left has got the feet balanced. And then the image on the right has got a slight foot forward, left foot forward, and then the man has got a larger foot forward. So if we start to think of this symbol and make sentences out of what you see, and you see that the arms of each of the goddess figures on either side are around the masculine, then we see that there's the support of the feminine consciousness and that the masculine is actually looking to take a step into that. Now, another thing that we can look at is the way the crowns are. That crown is actually the shape of the thymus gland. So the Egyptians were very focused on procreation. And so Freud came along and said it was penis envy, but really it's procreation envy. So the idea of how we recreate was very important to the ancients. And so there's encoded symbols in the hands and feet, and a lot of people say that the Egyptians really didn't know how to do their sculptures and they were making mistakes, but there's really something in a coding. And I often think, if it was us, and I really do think that a lot of this is a reincarnational thing, and that it was us, and that we were leaving symbols for ourselves when we knew we were going to go into a totally dark age. How would we leave these symbols? What would we leave for ourselves to interpret? And the other thing is we keep getting told the same old story over and over again, and that becomes like propaganda. And so how can these pure symbols be sitting right there and we miss them? And just like the figure ground drawings, once you see what the hidden code is, then you continue to see it. Okay, so here again we have two right hands. And again. So if you take two people and each person takes a hand, then often your hands can be replicated that way. So it's kind of tricky to play with it. Now, if you'll notice, let's see if I can get this going. This is King Tut and his wife Ankhesepaten. And so she was one of the daughters of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. And so when King Tut took the throne, the only way that he could have the rightful right to it was to marry within the matrilineal line. Now, we know with mitochondrial DNA, if we took my father, my DNA, and my son's, and one of you, you could see that all three of us were connected in the same family, and that my son was the youngest, I was in the middle, and my father was older. That's one of the things that mitochondrial DNA will allow us to see, but we could see that you're in a different gene pool, okay? So there's something about the matrilineal line that was protecting the blue blood. But when you look at their feet, again, you see that they're wearing one pair of sandals. And again, if we see the Egyptians as infantile and illogical, then we can say, well, they just forgot the shoe. But actually, what the symbol is that they're walking down the road of life as if they're one person. And so they only need one pair of shoes. Okay? So I think that's quite a lovely thing. Hello. Now, these are the typical wigs for men. And you see that they're like steps. Now, here you have a female wig, which is parted down the middle and long, and then the stepped wig for the man. But when a man had high status, he wore a female wig. Okay? And so this is indicating that feminine consciousness was honored. Okay? So more examples of wigs. But then when you see the scribe, who had the highest status because they were recording the initiation rites in the temples, and then these papyrus scrolls would go up the Nile and end up in the Library of Alexandria, which was destroyed on 3 different occasions. In fact, nothing can really be destroyed, and some of these parchments were preserved, but right now there's only a replica of one single parchment in the new Library of Alexandria. There's only one parchment left. So there are many symbols of the goddess with animal heads and also of gods and human bodies. Now, Graham Hancock has talked about terianthropes, half animal, half human, and he also talks about hallucinogenic plants and ayahuasca that take you actually into another dimensional sphere. And when you go into the 4th dimension, you end up seeing animal-headed gods, so that this was another symbol of departing from this reality. So pretty much everything in Egyptian mythology is about not really being here. And I'll show you other things about that we're here on Earth, but we don't really belong here, that we actually come from somewhere else. And then the animal totems, as you'll see in shamanism, provide characteristic features. So Sekhmet was the assertive and aggressively protecting her young and saying, that's not okay. And in some ways, women in our times have lost the right to make those kinds of statements. And those of us who are a little bit bolder, have come into that. But women are supposed to, tone it down and not make a fuss. Now, this is one of the only statues that's left in situ. There are some, but in Egypt, where things have been taken out of the temples and put into the museum. And so it's hard for us to put the story back together because we don't see things where they were in the original times. Now, there's a hole at the top of this shrine to Sekhmet in Karnak, and the light shines in over her face, and you stand in. What the ancients would do is they would stand and they would ask a question with a yes-no answer, very much like you would ask a pendulum. And if she cried, a little tear came, we perceive that, the answer was no, and if a little smile came, the answer was yes. And so this figure was actually used as an oracle. And here you see her with Isis. Now, the archetypal images are images and symbols that even if you're unconscious of them, they still exist. Okay, so people say, what's an archetype? And it's very difficult to define. But we all have these archetypal constructs within us, but most of them we're unaware of them, okay? And so you see over and over again that these figures are here with all of these different symbols in their headdresses. So we can say that this was perhaps symbolic of the age of Taurus. They say it's fallopian tombs, it's the disk of the sun, and it's really talking about procreation. She is wearing a bird on her head, which is saying that really we're more spiritual than we are terrestrial. And here, bare-breasted women all the way through it. Definitely the Egyptians were not just like us. Whoops, I went too far there. Now, this is a little bit difficult to see, but what you see here is the pharaoh, and there's all these different symbols here. You've got the arm of Sekhmet on one side, the arm of Isis on the other, and then we have Thoth, the record keeper. Now, he's wearing a disc, but it could be a sun disc, and these are not like fallopian tubes. It's a different kind of horn. This is another symbol of the double horn, the double crown, with the thymus inside something that can be structured as the womb. So we look through our patriarchal lenses and say, oh, it's a symbol of Upper and Lower Egypt, and they were fighting, and then they came together, and whatever. It became a political statement. And so you see, where am I? They're showing the ankh, and they're sticking it up the nose of the pharaoh. Now, the ankh is a symbol of life. It's a symbol for fresh water, which we couldn't live without the water. And priests and priestesses were the ones who dealt with water. Now, just like you saw at Tiwanaku, there's all these water passageways underneath the pyramids. That's very, very much so underneath the Giza Plateau, and in the area of the Band of Peace, which is the subject of the DVD, which goes from, there's 6 different distinct sites, from Dashur to Abu Raush, Giza being one of them, and a network of tunnels that goes all the way through. So there's a lot more than meets the eye. And then you see a crook and a flail. So the flail is a symbol of the balance of the mind. The crook is the balance of the emotions, and the staff is the balance of the body. Now, we don't see the bottom of it here, but in other images you'll see it. The staff separates into 2 pieces, but it never really touches the ground. So if you ever see modern art of Egypt, they often have the staff touching the ground, but you'll never see that in an authentic Egyptian piece. And what it means is, it's the balance of the body. We split into duality, but we don't really touch the earth. That means we're spiritual beings having an earth experience. And so here's an example of that right here. Right? So it splits into 2, and it doesn't touch the ground. And then we have offerings to the goddess. And so here's Isis. She's got the symbol of life, and she's seated on the throne. And over again, here we have the crook. And so they're holding all these symbols, but if you add up what these symbolic representations are, then you can make a story by making a sentence out of these different images. And again, you see, so this is from the temple of Seti I. So you see Isis with the slight foot forward, and then you see Seti I with a large foot forward, and then Horus sitting on the throne. So symbolically, Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris, and he represented each pharaoh which was the culmination of consciousness. And so the idea was that the most conscious person ruled, and that's not what we've got going on now. Yes, it is amusing sometimes. Now, there's a couple of times in ancient Egypt where the resurgence of the old consciousness showed. And one of the times was at Abydos, and there's another temple that's completely below that, the Osirian, and then we've got the newer temple that's quite a bit higher. And then in the time of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, they were bringing a lot of these images back forward. So it's almost like even in dynastic Egypt, there was a certain amount of amnesia toward these sacred concepts, and there was a couple of times where there was a cycle that brought a higher level of consciousness, and somebody who was in charge that was able to bring these symbols forward. And so at Abydos, we see many of these. Did I go too fast? Sorry. Whoops. And? Okay. So we see many of these different scenes, but there's entire rooms that are dedicated to the goddess, and we often overlook that. And here's Isis and her beloved husband, Osiris. Now here he's got the crook, the flail, and the staff. Now, he's got blue skin, she's got yellow skin, he's got red skin. Now, it could be that Osiris was actually, they're off-planet beings, and he was from Orion, she's from Sirius, and the terrestrial beings are in red. So these are ideas that are deeply symbolic, but are also exposing the idea that maybe we're not from here. And again, you see the image of the lotus repeated. So there's temple pillars, and the capitals are either a papyrus or a lotus. And again, this is a symbol of the balance between the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine. And so when you see lotus flowers and they're given as an offering, it's about keeping the feminine consciousness present. And so this looks like a pipe, but it's really incense. And these are all offerings. Now, you also see them many times with hand positions. It's almost like they're generating energy. And then you'll see these bands here at the wrists and the ankles. Now, well, some of them have them and some of them don't. And again, each of these scenes is depicting something that's telling a story of something in particular. Now, these bands tend to be training in sex magic from the temples of Isis. So they understood that there was some charge between the masculine and the feminine. The high-level initiates were trained separately. The females were trained, the priestesses were trained in one location, and the priests were trained in another. But then they would come together and the separation was not because they didn't want to have the masculine and the feminine together. It was because it built a charge. And then the sexual energy charge was part of the transmutation of the atom, which was building the energy in the body. And then they were able to literally transmute the atom. And so that was represented also in the zigzag water patterns underneath the plateau. And there's granite structures there, crystalline matrices. And they were blowing the water molecules apart into hydrogen and oxygen, and that was part of the implosion energy, magnetic, non-polluting energy that was not static energy like electricity. Now, one of the things about static energy is it's the antithesis to the spiritual process, and some of you who, I know I become very sensitive to light at night, and I don't want the electric lights, we want candles and that sort of thing, and there's something about the static energy and overhead lights, neon lights, that really cuts that charge. And what the ancients were doing is they were building a charge in their bodies, and it's like they're human divining rods. So the cosmic energy can't come through into the earth unless there's a conduit, just very much like neural synapses don't touch each other. A hormone will jump across, and that allows you to be, the brain to get the signal to be able to move your arm. And so the other thing is the bands on the wrists and the ankles, part of that was when they were taking a huge amount of energy charge, the bands would protect them so that they wouldn't get electromagnetic-cuted, as I say. And so you see over and over again that there's offerings being given to the goddess. And again and again. And then you get these curious depictions where this is actually Isis. Here's her son Horus, and then she's taken on his head, typical head. So again, big step forward left, small step forward left. All of these different frescoes become metaphors in the story that they're telling. Now at Medinet Habu, which is actually a temple that was built later in the 19th, 20th dynasty, you still see images of the goddess sitting on the throne supporting the pharaoh. Now, in Erich Neumann's book, he said, there's a picture and it says the pharaoh's sitting on the throne, but the pharaoh's actually sitting on the lap of Isis, and Isis is sitting on the throne. And then you see here these winged discs, and it's always at the entrance to the temple. And the symbol here is that the initiates would stand, and even the public got to go into the first hypostyle halls, but the lower self surrenders to the higher self, and then you go into the temple and do the work. And so what you see, it's neckbit. So you've got the vulture is the symbol of the feminine, and then the snake is a symbol of the masculine, and you see them together over and over again. So the idea is if you don't have the masculine balanced with the feminine, you can't do the spiritual work. If you're in your ego, in your lower self, you can't do the spiritual work. And so the passageway into the temples was really important, and often the initiates would be anointed with sacred oils and that sort of thing. And so you see that over and over again. Now, Hathor. You've probably noticed by now that most of the images that you'll see in Egypt are profile. So they're like a two-dimensional image that actually is showing somebody being here in the third dimension. Hathor, on the other hand, is one of the only images that you see her full on. She's also got cow ears. So the idea is that she's a fourth and beyond dimensional being who's here offering us a perspective. And so these are scenes from the Temple of Dendera. And again, you see offerings. The seated figures are all feminine. And there's a temple called Esna, which is along the Nile. And when they found it, it was buried. The village actually is way above and the temple is below. And it took them 50 years to get the sand out. And the Christians didn't come along and destroy it because it was buried in sand. And so what you see along the walls is seated figures of Isis, Sekhmet, Hathor, Mot. And so it's all there. It's all there if you're looking. And so here you have the feather of Mot, the body of Osiris, and it's Isis and her sister that are coming to revive Osiris and bring him back. And then you've got the record keeper. And so often you'll see, okay, so Thoth is the ibis-headed god, but then you see the ibis. And so you see the animal figure manifesting inside the human, and then all these seated figures. And again, here's the winged disc. So here is the symbol of the sacred masculine all across the top. And often if you count these, there's some kind of processional calendrical thing. And then here's the winged disc. So you've got the vulture, you've got the sun, and then you've got the symbol of the sacred masculine in balance with the sacred feminine. Now, back in the Temple of Karnak, there is what's called the Temple of Dreams. This is a temple that's locked, as is the Temple to Sekhmet. It's very difficult to get in there, but if you can get in there, you see all of these doorways within doorways within doorways, and you see this in other places in Egypt as well. But they're dimensional doorways. And so there's energetics here, and if you go in there and you meditate, you can actually feel the pull of these dimensional spheres. And so this was common knowledge to the ancients. Now, here we go. Picture. Oh, whoops, now it's going too fast. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. Okay. Stop. Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to go back there. Maybe I can show you one more time. But the temple, the Sphinx temple, is one of the most guarded places. It's impossible to get in there. But what they've done on the Giza Plateau is they've cemented over the Temple of Isis that used to be there. There's ancient or old pictures, like from the 1900s, of a lot of stuff there that you can't get to anymore. It's literally under the cement. And, you know, Michael Cremo's work in forbidden archaeology, if they find something that's anomalous or a giant and it doesn't fit with traditional archaeological views, it gets buried and cemented over. Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of erasing of the evidence. Now, whether this is unconscious or deliberate, we'll probably never know. but unconscious is enough of a reason for them not to be trying to preserve this sort of thing. And there are passageways that go all the way from the Sphinx Temple, which is the slide before, and I'll run that little animation again, and maybe you can grab it in your eye. And then it goes, there's passageways that go all the way under to where there were initiation chambers in the second pyramid. Now, in the documentary that's here, Robert Schock is talking about how, in a lot of ways, the second pyramid was the dominant pyramid, and it looks dominant in various views of the Giza Plateau. And so we really don't have the whole story. But when there's prophecies that talk about at the foot of the Sphinx, even the Edgar Cayce stuff, the foot of the Sphinx is the Sphinx Temple. And that passageways going to the Great Pyramid, well, in the olden times, the second pyramid was the Great Pyramid. So when we hear these prophecies, we get all mixed up. And I think that's part of it, because we're kind of told what we should think about it, but then we don't know what to think. But the doorways, of course, are covered up. Now, in my own personal experience, I started having visions of this temple and passageways that were low, and I went looking in Egypt for 10 years. And I could feel myself getting warm and getting cool, and then I'd go back and I'd have the visions again. Well, it turned out that this place was the Sphinx Temple. And when I finally got there, kicking off my shoes, the initiates never wore shoes in the temple. If you know the search for Om Seti, she was taking her shoes off as well. And I knew when I got in there, I could smell the flowers, I could see the priestesses and the candles and everything, and I knew that around the back there was going to be a door. And I went, and sure enough, big metal plate locking it. But in that other picture, you can see where it used to be in the old... Okay, let's see if we can do that one more time. It's going too fast. I can't slow it down, sorry. But here's some more old pictures. Now, the Brooklyn Museum, in May of 2008, finally published these high-resolution Creative Commons pictures that we can all go and see and use now. And what these are field notes. And so if this is blown up, you can actually read what these notes were. And a lot of things are traditional, and some things are not. But you can see that the Sphinx actually, was quite different before the $80 million 10-year restoration that they did. There were a number, and basically what they did, and I think of it as a feminine figure, that they put her in a plastic bag. And it's like if you were at the beach and you had a sand castle, it would basically break apart as it dried up. So if you pack it into a cement thing, then, because there's only one place now. You'll see in newer pictures of the Sphinx, there's a square, kind of open area, and the only original place of the body of the Sphinx is inside there. And again, it's very difficult to get in. You're not allowed, but I've been in there. And the side of my shoulder touched the edge, and it's like 2 kilos of sand just fell. So it's like crumbling, basically. But a lot of the restoration that they did made it worse because it's sweating and it's the wrong kind of substance. And I think they had many, like 80 different archaeologists and talking about how they're going to restore it, and everybody's arguing with everybody, and then they basically decided, like I said, to put it in a plastic bag. But there are many passageways and openings that were there, again cemented over. And I spent a lot of time inside the cavities of the body of the Sphinx. There was a period of 5 years where somehow I was able to get in a lot of these places after hours, and the guards, the watchmen, started to let me go in there alone. And what I noticed is that when I went in with with any watchman present, it's that their consciousness was magnified as well. And so it made it really hard to feel what the real energy was. So they started to just let me go in, and the experience was magnified exponentially because of that. But I've never spent any time inside the body of the Sphinx where it didn't take 72 hours of processing where I didn't sleep every single time. And I started downloading all these light codes, and there's lots more to say about that. And so you can see that even in the 1900s, the river was actually going quite close to the Sphinx. Sphinx and the pyramids. And you can see the old bed. Let's go back one. Now, from aerial shots now, and there's quite a lot of aerial shots in the documentary, you can see that this is where the old riverbed was. But this is just the flooding, periodic flooding at just after summer solstice in July. And so that's not a lot of water there, but the water used to go all the way up to the level here. And then you can see the causeways, and the valley temple was like a reception area, and the barges were there, and the initiates could just step off. Just checking my time. So things aren't the way they used to be. And in the documentary, you'll hear Hakim talking about the Sphinx being covered to the neck. And so now they've got this huge wall there. They've done all kinds of work basically to keep people out, locking the pyramids so you can't get in, that sort of thing. But there were times when people could just walk around and look at things. So times have changed, for sure. The other thing is that the pyramid was blasted open, right? And so the passageways were forced entries. And so here's the guys that were doing the explorations. Now, archaeology is a relatively new science. It's only in the 1910s that it was established as a science, and it's a destructive science. But prior to that, it was people who had money, who went on expeditions, who were basically just looking. And, whoops, there's that guy again. So, but this comes from these field notes. And I think we're done. Now, this is also different, right? And the paws were all reconstructed, and the face was, there's lots of changes that have happened. But also, when you think about John Anthony West and Robert Schoch's work about the weather erosion, well, it was covered in sand. So how could those other people have begin to consider that? So there's been lots and lots of permutations and different things that have gone on the plateau. But basically, what we're doing is we heard the history of Egypt from Herodotus, who was a Greek, who talked to the locals. And then we just have been repeating the same story ever since without really looking deeply into the symbols. So it's almost like propaganda. And you really can't go to Egypt without an Egyptian guide. I pay them to be silent because as soon as they start talking, they're talking about Ramses, they're talking about the last period of time, they're not looking far enough back. And it actually isn't the right story. So here we go. So there you can see the Sphinx Temple. These are all automatic. And there's that passageway that I was talking about. And that's the boat pit, and I'm going to show you stuff about the boat. And there's the causeway. And, okay, here we go. So as David was saying, cross-Atlantic travel and oceanic travel is the highway. It's the easiest way to go. But what they say is that this was a solar boat that helped the pharaoh make his transition to the other world. And there's no way that it was really water. Well, when the river moved, they buried the boats. There's boat pits everywhere. But you can also see that there's water marks because the boat was actually in the water. So, but they didn't really go anywhere. And then there's cabins here where they actually could have slept and, oars. And then you see little figurines in the museum where people are on boats. You see it on the temple walls. Maybe they're just thinking about the expedition that Queen Hatshepsut took down the Nile to Ethiopia to get frankincense and myrrh. And here we go, the unthinkable. Now, some of you may know this. Now, Egyptologists are told they're not supposed to tell anybody in the Temple of Abydos about this particular area. And it used to be that there was another piece of stone over the top, and only recently, in, 20, 30 years, it fell off. And what did it reveal? Oh. Okay, so it's difficult to see, and that's why I've put the white over the top, but there's all kinds of stuff about Egypt that we're not really supposed to discuss. Now, here is the passage into the Temple of Seti coming back from the Osirian, and this is the King's List. And interestingly, the real movers and shakers, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Tut, they're erased from the King's List, okay? And again, if you erase it, hide it, and put it underneath cement, then it didn't happen, right? Well, maybe it did. And so we've been talking, David was talking about these distended skulls. Here's my hit on that. And I've seen the Peruvian skulls at Ica through Dr. Henvier Cabrera. And you can see that there's flat marks where they actually distended the skulls. But you can see in the X-rays of Tut and other images from the 18th dynasty that it's not flattened. And I think that there was something going on anomalously, genetically, starseed, who knows what. And I've always maintained that funny-shaped hat covers funny-shaped head. And so here we have Ramses. And some of you are familiar with these power rods that they held. And if you go online and go Egyptian power rods, you can even purchase some of these. And this was part of how they were dealing with energy. So there's lots of curious stuff. And then there's all this connection to sacred cosmology. So here we have Nui, and this is an image from my book. Left foot forward, the two hands touching the ground. Hathor here. And you see these rays of the sun if you're at the Temple of Dendera and you look up where the sun comes in, you can see these notches. And so the idea here is that Nui would swallow the sun at night and give birth to it during the day. And the cycles of the sun were represented in her body. And now this is on the ceiling. It's very difficult to get these pictures because you basically have to lie down on the ground. But again, you see Hathor. Now, these beautiful headdresses flank the columns of the hypostyle hall at the Temple of Dendera. And the Christians came along and they used to sharpen their chisels. You see these like gouged out marks at the bottom of pillars. And they spent years in there destroying these images. So years ago, when I first got Photoshop, way back in, 94 or something, I took the eye from one and the ear from another and reconstructed because they're all damaged. And it's really quite disturbing and very, very beautiful. And so here's the hands again. And now, this is the ceiling. And what you see is images of the zodiac, the Pleiades, the solar boat of the king going along. And so all of this is a mythological story, okay? And it's right on the ceiling, which is a good place for it. And then you see the tops of the capitals of the pillars, as I was mentioning, but they're difficult to see from here, but they're those Hathor faces. And again here, stories, seated goddess, over and over and over again, up the temple walls. And then they didn't have a word for death in Egypt. And so if you listen to traditionalists, they're going to tell you that the Egyptians were obsessed with death. They don't have a word for it. Well, we're missing something there too. They called it westing, which the sun did every night, is it would go down to the west. And so on the lid of a sarcophagus, you have Nui, the sky goddess. Some people call her Nut, but I don't think she was a nut. And Nui means night. In French. And so this is actually a reflection of a mirror in one of the sarcophagi in the museum. But if you were in the sarcophagus and you were passing, you'd see that you were going home back to the stars. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff that I can cover here. And I'm only going to touch on it. This is the unfinished obelisk. And so you can see here how they dug things out. Now, pretty much all this high-level technology is attributed to men in their tutus pulling things with ropes and their little chisels. And there are 2 copper chisels in the museum. And they say, see, we figured it out. That's how they carved it. Now, does that look like that? And they say, see, we proved it. They knew how to do it with chisels. It's like, I'm sorry, that's not very satisfying to me. I think they had a superior technology. And anyway, I'll leave it said. Now, the ancient zodiac is there. And you see here, there's another image of it, but there's 2 figures of Horus and then a figure of Isis. And here's all the zodiac that goes around. But it represents larger cycles of time. That's actually a precession and a half, which is 39,000 years. And so they knew something. Okay, so we need to consider a new chronology. And so I think what's wrong is that we don't have the scaffolding to place this. It's difficult for us to think that far back about what can happen. Now, in this audience, I think we've had a little bit of practice. But we see the so-called Pyramid Age. The age of dissolving boundaries is what we called the age now. And then here we have dynastic Egypt starting, where it went from being matriarchal to patriarchal. And then all of these images of the great cosmic mother, and this is part of the cover of the documentary series. But this was found in 11,500 BC, and again, bare-breasted goddess figure from the bird cults, and you'll see that kind of thing in Crete as well. And then we have the world flood, and there were a couple of periods of flooding, and then the old cave drawings, and then it goes back to older images of large goddesses, and part of the symbolism there is when famine was ever imminent and we were hunter-gatherers, women would only procreate every 5 years. And then they started with horticulture, the whole idea that you can take a plant and move it to the mouth of the cave, and then they started with agriculture, meaning that if you can have one plant, you can have rows of plants, and then that started to mean that the goddess would, that the women would procreate every year, and then males got the idea that maybe they had something to do with it. But prior to that, it was all procreation envy. And the other thing is the flood. Like I often think that if we're all living on our homes in Canada in the winter and the power grid went down, we would only last a couple of days in our homes. And so we'd have to go find shelter. So let's say there's 1 million people in my city in Calgary and like 4 people lived. We'd end up in a cave somewhere, and then we would start probably writing on the cave walls. It doesn't mean we're stupid and we don't know technology. It means the grid went down. So we know that there were world floods. And one of the things that Thomas Brophy is going to be talking about later is this Naphtha, which is calendrical stone circles that date way back, and they're measuring alignments from 11,500 BC, which is where that we started over again. Gilf Kebir, he'll be talking about as well, is another calendrical circle that was found at what they call the corner of Egypt between the Libyan, Sudanese, and Egyptian border, and actually some tourists tried to go in there recently, and it didn't turn out too well. But Kebir is big, and Gilf is plateau. And it's the Cave of the Swimmers is there, and even though the English Patient was filmed in Morocco, it's representing Egypt, and there's all these people swimming. Okay, well, hello, there's a flood, a few people swam to a place that was higher, started over again, and started marking those astronomical alignments that we were using before when we had a higher level of technology. So, we need to think of things differently, understand that we've been in terrible dark ages, that we did plant seeds for ourselves when we woke up to remember. Reincarnation was outlawed in the Council of Nicene, so we're taught that we're not supposed to think in those terms, but I think we're all the reincarnates from then who remember. So, I rest my case and I'm ready for some questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, there's a microphone over here so it can be recorded. So who's got a comment or a question? Is somebody going over there to the mic? Yes.
This is more of a comment than a question, but after watching you talk about the funny hats and the funny shaped heads, and the gentleman before talking about the same thing, it occurred to me what the pontiff's hat looks like. Since I was raised Catholic, I'm very aware of that, and it's the same shape, interestingly enough. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, though.
Well, they're copying the colors are red, white, and black, Virgin Mother Crone. The priests are wearing dresses. They're copying from another time and space.
Thank you.
Yeah. Someone else, please? Let's have lots of questions. Go ahead. 2 more. Okay.
Hi, my name is Carlos Aguirre. I've been to Egypt and watching, knowing that the Egyptians don't do anything happenstance. What is the significance of having 2 females counterbalancing, for instance, the pharaoh?
Having 2 females balancing what?
The masculine. In other words, you have the pharaoh supported by a goddess and the queen.
Lots of feminine support, no?
Yeah, but they say 2 to 1.
The pharaoh needed lots of help.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about the power rods and the magic wands. I know they found quite a few magic wands from ancient Egypt. Have you ever had a chance to hold one or even the power rod? Because with your ability
Well, I certainly remember them from another life, let's put it that way. So we were working with a tremendous amount of energy, which is why I don't like reenactments when you see something in a movie on Egypt, because the posture is not quite right. And the ancient Egyptians they stood straight and they had, a lot of energy moving through their body, and we're not there now. So I don't remember it from this incarnation, but I sure remember it from others, if that's an answer I can offer.
This is a little bit before Egypt, and it has to do with something slightly glanced upon, which is the conversion from hunter-gatherer to farming.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if you have some research that talks about farming seemed to come around about the same time that militarization did. And so
Did you say militarization?
Militarization. And it kind of, I've always noticed that the advantage for rulers of farmers is that they're stuck in one place and you can come by and take the result, their harvest as taxes. And I'm wondering if you've done any research back before Egypt during that period of time when it changed from autonomous tribal hunter-gatherers to conquered militaristic farmers.
Well, I think agriculture was there in peaceful matriarchal cultures, and that the patriarchy did come along, and the warring deities and all of that came along. I don't think that they're connected. Agriculture didn't make war. But John Burke is going to talk about energizing seeds and the timing of how the pyramids were used and that sort of thing. So I think that you're going to get an answer there. But it doesn't follow that agriculture made war. I think we're done, right? One more question at the back, and then we'll call it a day, or a session. I can't hear you. The Egyptian zodiac, pardon? Yes? The ceiling of the temple is Dendera. The original actually was cut out, and it's at the Louvre, and they made a mold, and it's all kind of falling apart. So, zodiac, ceiling of the temple of Dendera. Okay, thank you very much for your questions and for your attention.